Now, in this morning's lecture, what I really want to do is to prepare you for assignment 2. I'm not actually going to be covering any new material as such. Now, if we go into the lab section of the module, and this week, what you were doing is, this week, what you were doing was implementing automated tests for a web API. So we know about that. The next lab is this one here, where we introduced or reintroduced really Cicd, but in the context of a web API. I'm not requiring you to submit this lab, but of course the issue is that this lab is critical as a preparation for assignment 2. And so if I just click into it, so what I am recommending is that for next Tuesday, before next Tuesday's lab, you should really have worked your way through all of this. There's a second page in the lab, and it's not important for you to have this done before next Tuesday, but certainly you need to have all of this completed. And so, as I said, what the lab is really about is stepping you through setting up a CI/CD pipeline for a web API project. As before, the web API project is the web API that you are developing in Web App Dev 2. And I actually provide you with a download. And this download is that web API as it would have existed at the end of last week's labs. It doesn't include this week's Web App Dev 2 stuff in it. So it's pretty up to date. Now, what I've got is I've got that particular project inside in my VS Code, and I just want to talk a little bit about it. So we know that if I want to run my web API locally, I just do npm start from the command line. And what does npm start do? Well, if we look inside our package.json, we see that here's the start script. And so what start is doing is it's running something called nodemon. Nodemon is a utility that monitors the files in your project. And if any of the files have changed, then what it will do in our case is it's going to execute this over here. So that brings us on to Babel Node. What is Babel Node? Babel Node is a tool that will, first of all, it will take the file that you give it, which in our case is index.js. And of course, index.js has various imports, and those other files have imports. So essentially what Babel Node does, first of all, is it compiles all of your source code or transpiles it, which means it converts it back to ES5 standard. And having done that, it then runs that code using the Node platform. And that's what's going on behind the scenes. And as you know from Web App Dev 2, once you've typed npm start, whenever you change any of your source code and save it, then Babel Node will retranspile or recompile your code and make sure that you're testing the most up-to-date version of it. By testing, I mean when you're using Postman. Now, if I want to deploy my web API to some sort of cloud platform, I cannot have this retranspilation and recompiling going on behind the scenes, and neither can I use nodemon. So what I need to do is I need to create a build version of my web API. Just as we did with the React app, we created a build version, which we called bundling in that case. But bundling is essentially building. Similarly, we need to build our web API. So how do we do that? And that's really what's going on in the rest of my package.json. There's quite a lot of scripts that I've added in here. So building means taking your source code, which is more than likely written in ES6 plus, and converting it back into ES5. And the output of that build is what you see over here on the right. I've got a build folder. And if I expand that, you can see that my build folder has the exact same structure as my source code. So for example, I've got an API folder within it. And inside there, I've got my different endpoints. And if I drill down, then, here are my individual JS files. But if I clicked into any one of these are now the ES5 equivalent of your ES6 code. One critical difference is we don't see any import statements. Instead, we are using require statements. You don't really need to look through this code at all. The whole point is that you write your code in ES6 plus and Babel will compile it down to ES5. So how do I create this build folder? Well, if I go back to my package.json, then what you can see here is a whole series of commands that are quite similar. So if I just take, for example, this one here, what that is doing is I'm using the Babel tool and I'm pointing it at a particular source folder of mine. And what Babel will do is it will take all of the JS files in this folder, compile them back to ES5, and it puts the output into wherever I'm telling it to, which is, in my case, I'm telling it put the output into the build folder and put it into a subdirectory that is the same path name as the source directory. That's very important. So you can see here, for example, it's /API/movies. And in the build folder, I'm putting it into a subfolder called /API/movies as well, because I do want my build folder to have the exact same subfolder structure as my source code. And all of these other scripts that begin with compile are essentially doing the same thing. I've had to write a separate script for each folder in my source code. And I've also got, you can see I've got a compile, where is it? Sorry, I'm looking for compile all. Where's my compile all? There's compile all. What compile all does is it essentially runs all of the other compiles up here. npm run all is a little utility that does what you think it does. npm run all will run all of these scripts over here. And these are just referring to the scripts that I have up here. So compile all compiles all of my source code. And that's the main one, really. Now there are one or two other little things that you need to have inside in your build folder, but you don't need to compile them. In particular, all of the node modules have to be inside my build folder. And again, we can see inside my build, I have node modules. You don't need to compile, though, any of the node modules content. You just want to copy the node modules from your source folder into your build folder. And secondly, we need to copy the contents of the public folder, which is this one here. I want to copy essentially those two, node modules and public. They need to be copied into the build folder. And I'm doing that by means of these two little scripts here. NCP is utility that copies files from one folder to another. When you're writing package.json files with scripts like this, one thing you have to be conscious of is, are we going to be running this on a Windows platform or on a Linux platform or a Mac platform? Really, you want your package.json scripts to be independent of whatever platform they're being run on. And the Windows and Mac platform are the same in most cases, but there are a few tiny differences. For example, if I want to copy a file or a folder from from a source to a destination, on Mac, the command is CP, beg your pardon. The command is CP for copy, whereas on Windows, the command is COPY. So they're not the same. Now, if I want my scripts to be platform independent, then one way of overcoming that problem with the copy command is to use this little utility called NCP, which is just an NPM package. The other differences between Mac and Windows is if we want to remove a directory, the command on Linux is rm, whereas on Windows it's del for delete. So the solution to that problem is there's a little utility called rimraf, if you can see it being used up here. Rimraf is essentially delete a file or folder. And as we're on it here, I've got a script called clean, and you can see what the clean script does is it deletes the current build folder and just creates a new empty one. I've got a build script as well, and build, what does it do? It runs clean followed by compile all. So this is the script that will do everything for me in terms of creating my my built version of my application. So from the command line, what you would do is npm run build, and that's going to go through the full compilation of everything, creating the build folder, copying everything into the build folder, etc., etc. So if I hit return, it just works its way through all the compilations, copying, and so on. Now, that's fine. Now, again, back to if I want to run my web API in development mode, then as we said before, we just go npm start and hit return, and we know what's going to happen. But supposing I want to run my built version of my web API, when I run my build version of my web API, everything should work locally here as well. And I've put a little script into package.json to do that for me, but I could have typed the full command from the command line. And here's the script here. And what I'm doing is, I'll just skip over cross n for a second. Essentially what I'm doing is this is the command essentially, node. Node, of course, is how we run JavaScript locally. And I'm pointing at my build index.js. So that's how I run my built version of my web API locally. Now, what's going on ahead of that, though, is there are one or two environment variables. If I just, again, go back to my build folder, you'll notice inside of the build folder, I don't have a .env file, nor should there be. So how do I set up the environment variables that are required by my code when I'm running my build version of my application? Well, that's essentially what's going on here. Cross-env is a utility that we use to create and assign values to any environment variables that you want to. Cross-env is also platform independent. There's slightly difference between Windows and Mac as to how you set environment variables from the command line. And again, because I want my package.json to be platform independent, then this little utility cross-env handles that for me. And you can see the environment variables are ones that we're familiar with. I need to set MongoDB. I need to set the seed DB values, etc. So that means I can, from the command line, if I go npm run, sorry, no, I'm just going to pull that up a little bit. If I go npm, I have my MongoDB, local MongoDB running at the moment in a separate terminal. So if I go run, start prod, everything should really work. And so it does. It starts up my application in the exact same way that we would see it when we run our source code application via NodeMon and Babel Node. And why am I creating a build version of my application? Well, that's actually what we will deploy onto a cloud platform. And that brings us on to, I guess, the next part of what I want to illustrate, which is CI/CD. So I have a YAML file, and most of this is familiar to us already. So, you know, I'm doing some caching. I'm caching node modules, of course. I'm also caching the contents. By the way, if I look in my git ignore, sorry, just go back for a second. Clearly, we would not be pushing the contents of the build folder up to our GitLab or GitHub because the contents is generated. So that's why I am excluding it from, why I'm including it in my git ignore. Back to GitLab. So I am including the contents of the build folder in my cache because the build folder content is going to be used by more than one job, just as is the case with node modules. But yeah, the other new feature in my YAML file is this section here, because what I will want to do is I will want to run my tests up in GitLab. And so I need to have a MongoDB server running. And I've decided what you can do is you can actually get GitLab to start up a MongoDB server for you. And that's the effect of those two lines of code there. So it's very simple, really, to get a Mongo server running up on GitLab. And then we have the kind of stuff that we're familiar with. Here are my stages: install, build, test, deploy. Install, build, test shouldn't have any surprises for us. In the install, we're installing our node modules of our web API. In the build, we're doing exactly what I did a moment ago. I'm running npm run build. So that's going to create my build folder and all its contents up in GitLab. In my tests, I'm just doing npm test. No surprises there either. By the way, the tests are actually being executed against the source, but that's okay. I could have executed them against the build version, but here I'm actually just running them against the source version. And we've done this npm test. You know, I haven't talked about the testing code at all because it's quite similar to what we would have done in this week's lab. Moving on then. So here's the bit that's new, the deploy. I want to deploy my application. Now I've picked a particular platform called Heroku. And what you need to do, as the lab gets you to do, is in the lab's detail, you need to go create an account on the Heroku platform. And so I've done that. This is the Heroku platform, and you essentially just create a new app. The lab, again, as I said, steps you through it. You create a new app up there, give it whatever name you have. I've done that already. And so here's the app that I created. And this is where I want to deploy my my web API. So, but I want my GitLab CICD script to do that for me. And so Heroku provides a utility that that you can execute from the command line. I could have deployed it from my own command line, but I want GitLab to do it for me. And the utility that the Heroku platform provides is this utility called DPL, which presumably is short for deploy. Now, DPL is a utility that is written in a language called Ruby, which is another programming language, object-oriented programming language. And something about GitLab that we haven't had cause to use up to now is the following. We know what the purpose of this very first line in my GitLab YAML file is. What this line does is, sorry, is that the line I'm interested in? Yeah, we know what this does is it essentially creates a virtual machine instance and installs some software on that instance for you. So in this case, I'm telling it to install a VM, create a VM instance and install some node software for me. And that VM instance is being used by all of my jobs. But you can, using GitLab, you can, if you want to, have a different VM platform for a specific job. And that's what I'm actually doing down here. I'm actually asking it to create a separate VM instance, virtual machine instance. Really, it's using Docker, but we needn't get into that. Create a separate virtual machine instance and install, well, it installs the Linux platform on every instance, but as well as Linux, I'm also getting it to install the Ruby programming language. That's the effect of that line there. And the reason I need the Ruby programming language is because I'm going to be using a Ruby utility. You can see what I'm doing here is I'm actually installing some Ruby developer tools. This is, you can regard this as boilerplate. So the net effect of all of this really, and indeed what this line is doing is installing the DPL tool itself. So I need to do all of that inside in my deploy job so that I can use this particular tool that's provided by Heroku for me. And so to actually perform the deployment, well, it's just something it's a command you execute from the command line. In this case, I'm doing it from the command line up in GitLab. And there are just some parameters that you need to pass to the DPL tool. You need to tell it which particular platform you're deploying to. In our case, it's Heroku. Presumably the DPL tool can be used for deploying to other types of platforms as well. When you create an account on Heroku, Heroku generates an API key for you, and you need to specify what your unique key is as part of the command line. This here is just a environment variable that I have created up in GitLab for myself. If I switch over to GitLab, here's my GitLab repository or project linked to all of this. And you can see obviously that I've ran my pipeline already. So this is the install, this is the build, this is the test, and this is the deploy stages. But if I go into the environment variables part of this particular project and into CI/CD, there are a number of environment variables that you need to set up. Now the lab steps you through this, of course, but here you can see the various environment variables. So I've got Heroku app name, app key, API key, sorry. That will be unique to you, and you'll get that from Heroku. Heroku app name is whatever name you gave the app, the app that you created up in Heroku. In my case, the name I chose was this name here. And then there are some environment variables linked to the actual nature of my web API. So sorry, this mouse over is annoying me. My MongoDB, which in my case, I have MongoDB pointing at a Mongo cluster that I've created up in the MongoDB cloud platform, which you are familiar with from the web app dev 2. And I think I've set CDB to false or true, I can't remember. So back to my deploy job in GitLab. So essentially that line in my YAML file is going to deploy my web API up to Heroku. Now, what does that actually mean though? Really all that means is what Heroku will do is it will do a git clone of my project from GitLab. And the git clone will only give Heroku access to my source code. It doesn't have the build version of my application at all. What Heroku actually does is it runs a build itself of your source code, and it creates a build instance up in Heroku's own environment. But Heroku knows nothing about what we are uploading to it. We need to somehow communicate to Heroku that, first of all, this is a JavaScript web API based on Node. And we need to tell it, once it has built our application, how does it actually run the web API up in Heroku? And there are two things that you need to do to allow Heroku to work all of that out. One is in your package.json, you need to put a script with a prescribed name, and the name has to be post install. So what Heroku does is when it git clones your GitLab repo, it then goes looking inside the package.json for this particular script, and it just executes it. And lo and behold, what the script is doing is it is deleting the build folder if it exists, which of course it won't for the very first build, but it will for subsequent builds. And then it's running my compile all. So it's generating the build folder up in Heroku. So now at this stage, Heroku has created a build version of my application up in its environment, but then it needs to work out, well, how do I run the application? And the solution to that is related to this file here. So there's a special file called a proc file. And again, Heroku looks for this file in the repository that it has cloned. If it's not there, then it doesn't know how to run your application. So it looks inside the proc file, and there's very little in the proc file. It's just a one-liner. And this kind of tells Heroku, well, what you've actually built here is a web-related project, and this is how you start it. node build index.js. And of course, that's how, if you remember, if I just leave that open for a second, that's essentially what my start prod script was doing, or this one here. Okay, I was essentially, if I go right across, I was going node build index.js, and that's the exact same as what's inside in the proc file. The only thing that remains though is, how do I set up my environment variables up in Heroku, the various environment variables that I need, in particular, the environment variable that's referring to my MongoDB instance. Well, you can do that up in Heroku. Heroku also provides a way of declaring environment variables for a particular project. And again, the lab steps you through how you do that. So a lot going on there, undoubtedly, and you need to really work through the lab yourselves to crystallize everything that I've been talking about there. Now, where does that leave us? Close off that. I'll just pause in case there are any questions. I think the next thing I can do really is now look at the specification for the second assignment. So again, just to reiterate, you really need to have completed this section of the lab before next Tuesday. You can leave this part aside for a moment if you wish. So in the assignment specification then, if we turn our attention to that, and I think I just released this yesterday, maybe. And so there are no real surprises in here. The assignment is about creating a CI/CD pipeline for a web API, but of course the web API will be the web API that you will be submitting as your assignment 2 for the web app dev 2 module. So again, this assignment is tightly coupled with the second assignment in that other module. And in terms of, okay, the submission date is the same as well. You'll be submitting this or completing this by the 3rd of January, which I think is the same date as the Web App Dev 2 assignment 2. And the deliverables are all fairly familiar to us. If I just move on to the grading spectrum, so really the two key parts of this assignment are similar to the first assignment. It's all about testing and it's all about CI/CD. Although CD wasn't a big part of the first assignment, it is an important part of this assignment. But I would argue that based on the lab that I've just been talking about, I'm giving you a lot of the material that you need in order to certainly set up a CI/CD pipeline. You'll have to do some additional work to it, obviously, but you will have a very good baseline, I would argue, when you complete that lab that I've just been talking through. So in terms of the grading spectrum, if you're aiming for between 40 and 55, then make sure you've got, just going to bump up the size of this a little bit. You've got automated tests for all aspects. By baseline here, I'm talking about the web API as it exists at the end of the labs in the Web App Dev 2. So you need to have tested all of the features of that, as well as any new features that you add on to the web API. You always need to make sure you try and adhere to testing principles like the silent principle and all of the other ones that we've talked about. In terms of CI/CD, you need to have you essentially need to have the pipeline that I've just been working my way through there a moment ago. You need to have that just fully working for this assignment. And really, I've already given you the YAML file. So it's just a case of creating your app on Heroku, setting up your environment variables, and just getting it all to work. And having gone through that process in the lab, I'm hoping that should be reasonably straightforward to translate that across to your assignment. On the next grading spectrum, what I would be looking for is that you've got some good error handling as well. Now, error handling here would kind of mainly relate to making sure that the various authenticated and unauthenticated parts of your web API are working, and you've done a lot on authentication in the Web App Dev 2 module using the JWT and Passport, etc., etc. So make sure that you have tests that prove that when a request goes into a particular endpoint and the request does not include authorization, then you get the appropriate response back from the Web API. And similarly, you test it when you do have the appropriate authorization to access it. So also, you are familiar with Mongoose schemas, and the way in Mongoose schemas you can specify validation criteria on various parts of a Mongoose schema. So it would make sense that you would have some tests in your API test case that checks to see that those schemas are working properly. You know that the purpose of those schemas is to prevent invalid data from being written to the Mongo database. And if the Mongoose schema finds some invalid data, then it should return some sort of response. Your web API should return some sort of response to that effect. So your tests, you're going to have quite a lot of test cases, arguably, and just make sure that you use the nesting structures that Mocha provides you with. In other words, having describe blocks and inner describe blocks, etc. Make sure you've got those well structured. In terms of CI/CD, what we're really talking about here is adding on both continuous delivery and continuous deployment. And I'll talk about that in a moment. We need to remind ourselves what is the difference between continuous delivery and continuous deployment. But it's just, this really means that you need to extend the pipeline. You need to add some new jobs to it, and some of those jobs are going to be conditional on a particular branch being pushed to GitLab. And there is a branching policy, which I've documented at the bottom of this page. So that's what's additional in this particular grading spectrum. You need to have the continuous delivery, continuous deployment working. And then to get into this bracket, I'm not going to talk about this today. I can talk about it to you on Tuesday, because for now anyway, everybody is really going to be focusing on trying to meet these targets here, rather than aiming for the excellent target initially. As with the other assignment, the excellent grade band is really what you might focus on after you've got, all of the other stuff satisfied. So I'm talking about having continuous delivery and continuous deployment as part of your CI/CD pipeline. So we need to remind ourselves what that is all about. And I've just got a few slides. I'm not sure if I'm going to get through all of these today. I knew I had a lot to cover today, so if I don't cover it all, that's okay. It just means I'm going to complete it on Tuesday in the lab with you. So I've kind of spoken about this already. So running the API in development mode, that was when we used NodeMon and Babel Node, and that was all fine, but that doesn't, we can't employ that approach when we want to deploy our application to a production environment. And so I've really explained all of that. So we needn't to go through that again. Continuous deployment, continuous delivery. The difference is, as you might remember, although it's quite a while back now, continuous delivery, the idea is that, and I've underlined it, sorry now, is where you have the option of releasing new features. New features can be released to production at any time. And the idea there is that the decision as to whether a new feature is actually released to your production environment, and by production environment, I mean that users can actually use the feature. The decision whether new features of your web API are available to your end users or not, that decision is made by, presumably, let's say, the project manager, and he or she decides to release those features or not. But it's essentially a manual step. It's not automated. So if I've got a CI/CD pipeline where my CD really is continuous delivery, then the way that pipeline is going to work is it's going to have an install stage, a build stage, a test stage. The final stage, it will also have a deploy stage automatically to what we call a staging environment. There are two environments that you deploy your application to. One is called your staging environment. The other is called your production environment. The staging environment is only available to the actual software development team itself. The production environment is available to or accessible by your end users. So, so I might have, for example, I might have two Heroku apps linked to my web API. One of those Heroku apps is only accessible by the development team. The other Heroku app is accessible by the end users of my application. Now, if my CI/CD pipeline only supports continuous delivery, then the way that pipeline is going to work is after it has successfully completed the test stage, it will automatically deploy the application to the staging environment, but it will not deploy it to the production environment. The decision to deploy it to the production environment will have to be done manually. Okay, that's continuous delivery. Continuous deployment is where after your CI/CD pipeline has deployed the application to the staging environment, then it automatically deploys it to the production environment. There's no manual intervention. So can we actually, and the answer is yes, really, can we support both continuous delivery and continuous deployment as part of our CI/CD pipeline? Because that is what you're being asked to do in the assignment, in the second grading spectrum. So what am I saying here? Why do we need, how and why do we need CD? Again, this is kind of stuff that we've gone through before. Number one is fine. Number two, we want to run automated tests. Well, that's fine. We know how to do that. And number three, we want to deploy a build to a production-like environment. Our production-like environment is our staging environment, which I've been talking about. And then we can release new versions of the application at the push of a button to our production environment, but it's not automatic. This is a kind of a graphical representation of the difference between CI, continuous integration, continuous delivery, and continuous deployment. And again, we've seen this before. Now there are a few slight inaccuracies by unit testing here. Let's just call that testing. So when we've got a continuous integration pipeline, we've got a build stage, we've got a test stage, we've got a deploy to staging stage. So that's where we were deploying our application to our Heroku environment. And technically, you'd have an acceptance testing stage as well, where acceptance testing is where you would test your application against the staging version of it. Now, we're not going to worry about that, actually. We're just going to ignore that part. So the CI/CD pipeline that I am giving you in that lab that I've been talking about implements this full sequence here. If I want to extend this so that I have continuous delivery, then the important part is happening over here. So again, for a continuous delivery pipeline, I have a build, I have a test, I have a deploy to staging. But then the decision to go from having deployed it to a staging environment to deploying it to a production environment, that is a manual, or it requires manual intervention. It doesn't happen automatically. That's continuous delivery. And finally, continuous. The deployment is, the only difference is, again, we're ignoring this part of our diagram. The only difference is here, once our application has successfully deployed to a staging environment, then automatically it will deploy to the production environment as well. So clearly only software houses that have a very mature CI/CD process, only those software houses would be following continuous deployment. Most software houses would have continuous integration. A lot as well would have continuous delivery, but only very advanced ones would have continuous deployment. So continuous deployment is where this step here is automatic, whereas up here it's manual. So the last stage of the pipeline, as I've already said, is where you deploy to the production environment, and it is a manual stage in a continuous delivery context. The staging and production, yeah, usually the staging environment and your production environment are very similar. So in our case, they might be both Heroku based. And that's important because, you know, you want to make sure that you deploy your application to an environment that's available to the team, where that environment is very similar to the production environment. If they're very different, then you're less confident that when you do deploy it to production, that everything will be functioning properly. Whereas at least if you've deployed it to a staging environment that is very similar to the production environment, then you have a little bit more confidence, provided it's functioning properly in the staging environment, of course. Now, when I say that the last step in that pipeline for continuous delivery is manual, the way that actually looks in GitLab is being demonstrated or being illustrated in this screenshot here. So here's my pipeline. Here's my install, here's my build, here's my test. This is my deploy to staging. The last phase of the pipeline, it doesn't execute automatically. Now, I do have something in my YAML file to carry out the deployment to production, but it does not run automatically. It essentially is kind of frozen there. And what somebody in the team has to do, usually the project manager, is they have to click on that particular stage and trigger the execution of it. Hence, it's a manual intervention. And once that stage has been triggered by a human, then that stage is executed. In my case, that stage is going to be to deploy my API to the production environment, to a separate app let's say, up on Heroku. So you need to work out, how do I actually implement this particular stage in my YAML file? Because I've already given you the code for all of these stages here. I'm out of time, so I'm nearly done really. There's only 2 or 3 slides. I'm going to complete those slides on Tuesday with you. And also I need to go back to the specification and talk about the last grading spectrum. The branching policy is straightforward enough, and there may be 1 or 2 other issues as well in relation to the lab that I need to talk through. So Tuesday's labs are going to be pretty important. And of course, any questions that you might have for me, try and have them prepared before Tuesday's lab. But again, without annoying you by repeating it, it is extremely important that you complete that final lab in the series before Tuesday. Okay, that's it. So I'll talk to you on Tuesday. Bye for now.